Have you ever wondered, does God exist? Have you ever looked at the world around you and thought to yourself, was this created or evolved? Are rocks really millions of years old? Did dinosaurs roam the world not too long ago? Is there evidence for a worldwide global flood? Is the Bible reliable? Is it accurate? Is it true? Join us now for this exciting episode of The Evidence. Good evening and welcome to The Evidence. This is our 8th night together. We're almost to the end of The Evidence, but the next 2 nights, tonight and then tomorrow night, are important nights. We've been tackling some of the biggest questions that humans have asked down through the centuries. Questions such as, does God exist? Is there evidence in our world for creation? And tonight we're going into the Bible and looking at evidence for the afterlife. We're going to take a look at one of the most important and climactic events in the life of Jesus, actually, his death and his claim for the resurrection. If Jesus rose to life from the dead, that would be the most conclusive evidence that he is the source of life. And so tonight, we're going to look at the evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus. Before we cover that, though, I'd like us to take a look at the subject of the afterlife. You know, from as far back as archaeologists can dig, mankind has wondered about the afterlife. Is there something more beyond the grave? Is there a heaven? What happens when someone dies? This question has haunted people down through the centuries. And it haunted a little boy who happened to be walking through a graveyard on his way home from school. As he was walking through this graveyard, he began to read the epitaphs written on the tombstones. And one of the tombstones caught his attention. And it says this: "As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, soon you will be. So prepare yourself to follow me." Well, the boy wasn't very happy about that, so he took off his backpack and took out a pencil and scribbled something on the stone. And this is what he scribbled: "To follow you, I'm not content until I know just where you went." Archaeology is uncovering some fascinating facts about the different societies' beliefs about death. Travel with me to China. In China, archaeologists have uncovered something incredible. It's called the Terracotta Army. In a huge army of life-size clay statues. It's called the Terracotta Army, and it was made by Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. This massive army has 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, 520 horses, and 150 cavalry horses. Each of the figurines was constructed with a unique face. They were exquisitely painted to look as realistic as possible. So why the Terracotta Army? Well, I'll tell you in just a second, but one thing that was interesting is they found many of these soldiers holding real weapons. One of the swords that one of the soldiers was holding that they unearthed, they discovered that it was layered with chromium oxide 10 to 15 micrometers thick. All of this survived over 2,000 years, and the sword is still sharp today in pristine condition, which says something about how advanced China really was in 200 BC. The Western world, just to give you a comparison, the Western world didn't discover chromium until the 18th century, nearly 2,000 years later. And China was layering these swords in 10 to 15 micrometers of chromium oxide way back in 200 BC. Incredible. Now, the massive army was buried all around the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. The reason is Emperor Qin Shi Huang was terrified of dying, and was in constant search of the elixir of life. He hired scientists to search out, to try and find some sort of magic potion that would allow him to live forever. He didn't want to face the grave. He didn't know what was beyond the grave. Whatever was beyond the grave, he wanted to be prepared. Just in case his scientists couldn't come up with an elixir, he constructed this huge army and put it around his grave, hoping that this army would protect him wherever he went in the afterlife. Another fascinating view of the afterlife comes from the tombs of the great pharaohs of Egypt. Egyptians believed that when a person died, they had a life energy force called the ka. This life force would separate from the body at death and would live on in the underworld. Another force called the ba, the ka and the ba. The ba stood for the unique characteristics of each individual person. It was their personality. At death, the Egyptians believed that the ba remained in the body and the ka separated from the body. Well, in order to release the ba, or the person's personality, from the body so it could unite with the ka and form the Egyptian soul, the ak, they would do these unique rituals to try and release the ba to come out of the body and unite with the ka. And only when it united with the ka would it form the soul, which is the ak, and then it would be ready to travel on a boat. And this boat would go into the underworld where they would live a whole nother life. But the Egyptians also believed that the ba returned to the body of the deceased every evening to receive new life. So the Egyptians would embalm the body to preserve it from decay so that the ba could be joined to it each night and receive new life. That's why they mummified each one of those bodies. The Egyptians also buried different funeral objects with the people who died. They'd bury bowls or spoons or jewelry, different things that their loved ones could take with them into the underworld. They would also bury miniature statues of people who could serve the person and help them work in the underworld. So this was the view that the Egyptians had of the afterlife. Oftentimes, the deceased would have a statue made of themselves so that in case their body did not survive the mummification process or deteriorated somehow, their ba would still be able to enter something and receive new life. So they thought, at least it will be able to enter this statue. Tonight, I'd like to take a look together at what Jesus believed and taught about the afterlife, what the New Testament and the Old Testament taught about the afterlife. And then we're going to look at the historical evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We start tonight with one of the clearest pictures in the Bible that's painted for us about what Jesus really believed about what happens when a person dies. It's found in John chapter 11, and it's the story of one of Jesus' closest friends, Lazarus. This is what the story says. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." So, although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Now, one of the interesting things about Jesus is that Jesus did not fear death. He wasn't like the pharaohs, the Egyptians. He wasn't like Emperor Qin Shi Huang from China. He didn't fear death. So when he heard his friend was sick, instead of jumping on the nearest mule or donkey and racing to see him, Jesus stayed where he was for 2 days. That's very unlike what you and I would do if one of our loved ones was sick and dying. We'd catch the nearest plane fly the quickest route to go and see them, to be with them in their final moments. But Jesus didn't do that. Instead, he waited. The scripture said that he loved Lazarus and he stayed put where he was for 2 more days. Obviously, Jesus was not worried about Lazarus' sickness. The story continues, and it says, then he said, our friend Lazarus has what? Fallen asleep. But now I will go and wake him up. The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping. But Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. This story points out something very interesting that you find throughout the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament. And that is, from Genesis to Revelation, throughout the entire Christian Bible, according to Jesus and all the holy writers, death is like a sleep. That doesn't sound anything like the beliefs of the pharaohs or any of them. For them, death was the entrance or portal to a whole new world, a new existence. A world where there would be work, a world where mankind was elevated to the place of near gods. In fact, many of the relatives of those who died in Egypt would go to their tombs and write notes to the deceased. I've been to Taipei, Taiwan, and in many of the temples there, you burn money so that the deceased will have money. You burn notes or different things. In Egypt, they would write notes to their deceased. Now, I've never been able to read a note sleeping. Have you been ever able to read a note while you slept? Now, I've walked in my sleep. I've talked in my sleep. I've done a lot of things in my sleep. But I've never read a book or a note or a novel or anything else in my sleep. So if you can't read it in your sleep, could you read it when you're dead? Someone who's asleep can't read a note. Jesus' views on death being asleep are consistent with what the rest of the Bible teaches about death. Look at what the Old Testament teaches, and we're going to go through some of the kings in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings 2:10, it says, so David, what? Slept. He slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. Then it says, and Solomon, David's son, did what? Slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And then it says, and the days which Jeroboam reigned were 22 years, and he what? And he slept with his fathers. You find the same thing from the Old Testament to the New Testament, that the New Testament as well talks about death as asleep. In 1 Corinthians 15:6, it says, after that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have what? Fallen asleep. In Acts 7:60, it says, and he kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. This is when Stephen was stoned with stones and was killed. So why does Jesus, the Old Testament, and the New Testament in the Bible all refer to death as asleep? The reason is because sleep is an unconscious state, a time of complete inactivity, a time where you can't read notes, a time where you can't interact with other people, a time where all those activities, all of those things that you would normally do during the day stop. And the Bible mentions that at death, a person goes from a conscious life where they live, where they work, where they do different things to a place of complete inactivity, where consciousness ceases, where there can no longer be communication, there can no longer be interaction. The Bible says in Ecclesiastes 9, verses 5 through 6, the living what? Know that they will die. But the dead know what? Nothing. They have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, their hatred, and their envy have now perished. In fact, the unconscious state is so deep that at death, you wouldn't expect somebody to be praising God, even in death. How do we know this? Well, the Old Testament Psalms wrote about it. If you look in Psalms, listen to what it says. It says, the dead cannot what? Cannot sing praises to the Lord. Now, why can't the dead sing praises to the Lord? It's not because they don't want to. It's not because they wouldn't do it if they could. It's because they are sleeping. Now, when I'm awake, I love talking with my wife. When I'm sleeping, if I could, I would talk to her as well. And sometimes I do, in my sleep. In fact, the other night I caught her speaking in a totally different language. Like, what did you say? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. But I can't respond in my sleep. I don't know what's going on. My brain activity is just, I have no recollection. Someone could walk in the room when I'm dead in the sleep. I wouldn't know it. You could come and take everything off my dresser drawer. I wouldn't know it. Because in sleep, you don't know what's going on around you. And so it is in death. The dead cannot sing praise to the Lord, for they have gone into the silence of the grave. Death is not the migration of the soul to an underworld, overworld, or other world. It is the static, unconscious state of a person who has no life. Now, which story seems more like mythology and which one more like reality? The Egyptian description of the ka and the ba uniting to form the ak, which migrates to the underworld and receives the letters of loved ones? Or the picture that Jesus and the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament and all of the Bible writers paint, that sleep is an unconscious activity, an unconscious inactive state similar to sleeping. Now, what about the view that people go to heaven when they die? Didn't Jesus teach that? Well, back at our story with Lazarus, it says Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. And we've actually been there in our nightly lectures, and we've been there and seen that right there at Bethany, they have those cave tombs dated to the 1st century. And these cave tombs had large stones that you could roll across them. It took 4 or 5 guys to roll these heavy stones back and roll them back over. And he said, roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for how many days? 4 days. The smell would be terrible. Now, it's important to note that Jesus waits to come to the tomb of Lazarus for how many days? 4 days. There's a reason for this. The reason is that in Zoroastrianism, which originates in Persia, Zoroastrianism has a belief, and the belief is that when a person dies, the soul of that person hovers around the body for 3 days, waiting to see if there's an opportunity where it can come back into the body and reanimate the body. So in the Zoroastrian religion and in their mind, a person is not really dead until they've been dead for 4 days. And because there was trading between Persia and Israel and Egypt, Israel was really a crossroad for much of the Eastern world to go through Israel on their way into North Africa and Egypt. Many of these ideas and customs were converged into Israel. And so the Zoroastrian belief began to make its way into the Jewish culture of that time. And the belief that was popularly held was that when a person dies, the soul will hover around the body for 3 days, and after 3 days, on the 4th day, when it sees that the body is not it's not able to reanimate the body. The fourth day, it will depart. So Jesus waits to go to the tomb of Lazarus until which day? The fourth day. By this time, it was well established in all the people's minds that Lazarus was dead. There's no hope for this guy. He's been in there 4 days. By this time, his body's decaying, and he's not coming back. It was now that they believed that the soul was probably enjoying the glories of Abraham's bosom, a holding place before heaven. The story continues with Jesus. It says that they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me." Then Jesus shouted out, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Now, we're not going to look at the evidence for Lazarus' resurrection right now. But what I want you to notice with me is that for Jesus, death is not the migration of the soul to heaven or hell. Neither is it a form of reincarnation. For Jesus, death is an unconscious sleep which God can wake someone up from. If Lazarus had already gone to heaven, why would Jesus need to go wake him up? As he said in John 11, verse 11. And if Lazarus had gone to heaven, he sure would have had an incredible story to tell about it when he came back. I mean, everybody would have asked him, "So what's it like, Lazarus? What's it like?" I mean, we've heard some stories, we have some ideas, but what's it like? The amazing thing is there's not a single account from Lazarus of what it was like. No account of him walking with angels, no account of him walking before the throne of God, no account of him having any recollection of anything. It's as if that period of Lazarus' life, those 4 days, did not exist for him. As if he was completely unconscious and unaware of anything that transpired during those 4 days. And another thing that Jesus said, Jesus didn't say, "Lazarus, come down." He didn't say, "Lazarus, come up." He said, "Lazarus, come out." Where was Lazarus that whole time? He was in the grave. Jesus taught that the afterlife was not something we experience at death. Jesus taught contrary to what many believe. Many believe the afterlife is something that we experience at death. But Jesus taught that the afterlife was something that wouldn't be experienced by people until the end of the world. Let me share with you what John chapter 5 says. "Do not be so surprised. Indeed, the time is coming when" what? "All the dead." All the dead where? In their graves. "Will hear the voice of God's Son, and they will rise again. Those who have done good will rise to experience eternal life, and those who have continued in evil will rise to experience judgment." Again, we find Jesus' views of the afterlife are echoed throughout the Bible. In Daniel, the Old Testament prophetic book, Daniel chapter 12, the last chapter, verse 2, it says, "Many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will" what? "Rise up, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting disgrace." Back into the New Testament, in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, it says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. First, the Christians who have died will rise from their graves." Again, we find no mention of a mystical underworld where the dead live parallel lives to the land of the living. Instead, what we find in the teaching of Jesus is that the dead sleep and await the end of the world, a time appointed by God, and at that time they will be resurrected to life and experience the afterlife together at the same time. And that, let me just throw this in, that is just and fair of God. Why should somebody who lived 5,000 years before I lived get to enjoy heaven for 5,000 years longer than I get to enjoy it, right? Or why should somebody who is wicked 5,000 years ago experience torment and torture for 5,000 years longer than somebody else? You see the incongruency. So again, we find no mention of a mystical underworld where the dead live parallel lives to the living. The resurrection is at the very cornerstone of the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of his apostles, the teachings of the early church, and the teachings of the Bible as a whole. But there's a catch. The resurrection at the end of time is dependent upon the resurrection of Jesus, according to the New Testament. Let me read that for you. But tell me this, since we preach that Christ rose from the dead, why are some of you saying that there be no resurrection of the dead? For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. And we apostles would all be lying about God, for we have said that God raised Christ from the grave. But that can't be true if there's no resurrection of the dead. You see, at the very core of the apostles' and the disciples' belief, the very cornerstone of the whole building of doctrines that they built was the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus' resurrection was not true, then the whole New Testament comes crumbling down. The entire thing. Everything hinges on the death and resurrection of Jesus. This belief was so important, they declared if Jesus didn't rise from the grave, then they were all liars. The new religion they had promoted was a farce, and their faith and hope was empty. Just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. But there is an order to this resurrection. Christ was raised as the first of the harvest. Then all who belong to Christ will be raised when he comes back. The resurrection of Christ was the guarantee of the resurrection of believers at the end of time. Jesus' resurrection is the first fruit taste of what is coming for those who have succumbed to death. Romans 8:11, the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, and just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, he will give life to your mortal bodies by this same Spirit living within you. The truth of the resurrection hinges on the death and resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus didn't truly die on the cross and didn't raise from the dead, then we can't believe the apostles' testimony about death and the afterlife. But if there is evidence which can substantiate that Jesus actually died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, rose to life after 3 days, then we have a reason to believe that what the Bible teaches about the afterlife is true. So we're going to start by looking at the evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus. One of the main theories against Jesus having been raised from the dead is called the swoon theory. This theory basically says that Jesus was crucified and only looked as if he had died. But when his body was put in the cold tomb, he revived, was nourished back to health by his disciples, and fled the country and supposedly lived in India until he died in India. It's called the swoon theory. One of the first pieces of evidence for Jesus' resurrection that we can look at is the evidence that he actually died on the cross. The death of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels, contains medical clues. The authors of the Gospels were not trained medical examiners, had no medical background. Therefore, what they wrote down about the death of Jesus was either a historical record of what they actually witnessed or a fictional myth that they developed later into the story. If the story is a myth, then we would expect to see inconsistencies with what the story says about the happenings of Jesus and what current medical science knows today. Lee Strobel, in a book called The Case for Christ, interviewed Alexander Metherell, who is both a medical doctor and also holds his PhD. Dr. Metherell has looked at the physical evidence associated with Christ's death and compared it with current medical knowledge. One of the first clues he has examined is the description of Jesus sweating blood the night before the crucifixion. This is what it says in the Bible. Then, accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and went as usual to the Mount of Olives. There he told them to pray that you will not give in to temptation. He walked away about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Then an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him, and he prayed more fervently. And he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like what? Like blood, great drops of blood. Dr. Metherall says that sweating drops of blood is a rare medical condition called hematidrosis. It occurs under extreme psychological stress. What actually happens is the high levels of psychological stress produce a reaction in the body which breaks down the capillaries near the sweat glands. And then sweat and blood mixed together begin to ooze out of the pores. Jesus was not the only person on the planet to have ever had this condition. Leonardo da Vinci describes a soldier who began to sweat blood just before battle. According to Frederick Zugebe, a medical examiner for Rockland County, New York, he says that hematidrosis is well known and there have been many cases of it. It has been reported in 6 cases of men condemned to execution. It occurred in a case during the London Blitz. It occurred in one case involving fear of being raped and another of fear of a storm while sailing. And then we have the Roman flogging. It's another physical phenomena of Jesus' death called the Roman flogging. The Roman flogging usually included 39 lashes. It was with a whip made of leather with lead balls that would bruise the flesh and sharp bones which would cut it. The person would be flogged from their shoulders all the way down their back. In John chapter 19, verse 1, it says, Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The loss of blood would have caused the individual to go into hypovolemic shock. The symptoms of hypovolemic shock would include the heart begins to race, there's a drop in blood pressure causing fainting or collapse, the kidneys stop producing urine, and the individual becomes incredibly thirsty, craving fluid to replace the large loss of blood volume. And this is what we find in Jesus' description. As they led Jesus away, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, happened to be coming in from the countryside. The soldiers seized him and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Now, normally, the victim was to carry their own cross, which was 75 pounds. They would carry it all the way to where they would be crucified. Evidently, since Jesus could not carry his own cross, and someone else was called to carry the cross for him, he was fainting or struggling to be able to carry the load to where he needed to go. With the amount of blood he lost during the flogging, it's no wonder they had someone else carry the beam for him. John 19, 28 through 29, we also find Jesus saying, I'm thirsty. Jesus knew that his mission was now finished, and to fulfill Scripture, he said, I'm thirsty. A jar of sour wine was sitting there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a hyssop branch, and held it up to his lips. Here we have evidence that Jesus did indeed undergo hypervolemic shock. Jesus experienced extreme thirst. Another evidence of Jesus' death would be the crucifixion itself. In 1968, archaeologists discovered the remains of a victim who had been crucified in 70 A.D. He was crucified with a 7-inch nail driven through his feet, and on the end of the nail they found remains of olive wood from an olive tree, showing that crucifixion continued to happen all the way up to 70 A.D. and perhaps beyond. In crucifixion, these 5 to 7-inch long spikes were driven through the wrists of the victim into the crossbeam. The nails would go through the medial nerve, which is the largest nerve going to the hand. The experience of having those go through a person's wrist is like if you were to hit your funny bone. You know when you hit your funny bone, the ulnar nerve? When you hit your funny bone, you experience those shocks that go through your arm. That's the sort of experience, except far, far worse, of having a nerve crushed in your wrist, that particular nerve. It created such terrible pain that out of this form of torture, crucifixion, they developed a new word. The word was excruciating. The word excruciating literally means, in Greek, ek and cruciating. Ek means out, and crux means cross. It literally means a pain that comes out of the cross. Excruciating pain. Next, the crossbeam would be hung on a post, and the feet of the victim would be nailed into the post, crushing the nerves again. The shoulders would dislocate because the person was hanging there, and the victim would have to push up on their feet from that nail to try and breathe, because they could not breathe with their arms up in the air, stretched down. They would have to breathe, take a breath, and go down. A person would continue to do this until they no longer had strength to pull themselves up, and they would eventually go into respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis, carbon dioxide in the blood would begin to dissolve as carbonic acid, causing an increase in the acid in the blood. The heart would then begin to beat irregularly, and the victim would sense this irregular heartbeat and know that they were dying. And that's why we have Jesus saying, so when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. He knew that he was dying. Hypovolemic shock would have caused a sustained rapid heartbeat, resulting in fluid buildup around the heart, called pericardial effusion, as well as around the lungs, called pleural effusion. In John 19, it says, when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately two things flowed out. What are they? Blood and water. This report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you also can believe. Now, John, the author, is not a trained medical examiner. Why would he record blood and water coming out of Jesus' side for any other reason other than he's simply recording what had been seen? What we find is an accurate description of the death of Jesus with the physical phenomena of the story fitting perfectly with what is known today about such medical conditions. Some, in an attempt to avoid a resurrection, say, well, he just appeared to die. But Jesus really survived the cross. When he got to the grave, he woke up, his disciples found him, fed him some food, and carried him away to India. Even if Jesus had survived the cross, it's doubtful that he could have escaped anywhere. Think about it. Number one, there were too many people who wanted him dead and wanted to make sure he was dead. In Matthew 12, verse 14, it says, then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might destroy him. Secondly, Jesus was in no condition to run, walk, or travel anywhere after what he had been through. He went through the flogging. He had been on the cross. He had his nerves crushed in his arms and in his legs. How could he go anywhere? How could you travel that long journey from Israel to India? Well, you wouldn't be in any condition to go anywhere. Plus, the Roman guards who oversaw Jesus' death had their lives at stake if the criminal survived. Their very job was to make sure that the execution was fully carried out. We know this is true because in Mark 15, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So, number 4, the fourth reason we know that Jesus actually died, didn't survive the cross, is that the disciples had all fled. And we find them huddled in a room with the doors locked after his death for fear of their own lives. In John 20 it says, "Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews." The story of Jesus surviving the cross just doesn't fit the biblical account, the medical evidence, or logic of what is possible. So, what about the myth, or what about the burial of Jesus in a tomb? Was that a myth? Was Jesus actually buried in a tomb? In Mark 15 it says, "Then he brought fine linen, took him down, wrapped him in linen, and he laid him in a tomb." So was Jesus buried in a tomb? Number 1, the place where this is recorded is the book of Mark. And Mark is such an early source, it is doubtful that the burial of Jesus was mythology that crept in. If Jesus being buried in a tomb was a legend that developed later, we would expect to see competing stories. One story saying it happened this way and another story saying it happened that way, but all the stories agree. Number 3, the majority of New Testament scholars agree that the burial of Jesus is reliable. And number 4, Jesus' burial in the tomb was not contested by any of the Jews at the time. Instead, they requested guards to stand watch over his tomb so that Jesus' disciples wouldn't steal the body. So what about the resurrection of Jesus? Is that a myth, or is there evidence to support it? Well, let's look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The first evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is who the primary witness was. At that time, it was a male-dominated society. Primary witnesses were important because primary witnesses had to be credible witnesses. At that time, unfortunately, a woman was not considered to be a credible witness. The primary witness for Jesus' resurrection was a woman. It was Mary. She was the primary witness. But first century women weren't that high in society. In rabbinical tradition, this is from Rabbi Eliezer in Bamidbar Rabbah, section 9, page 204. It says, "Let the words of the law be burned, rather than that they should be delivered to a woman." In the Babylonian Talmud, it says, "Without both male and female children, the world could not exist. But blessed is he whose children are male, and woe to him whose children are female." Yikes. A woman's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't even allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. It would have done far more at the time if the primary witness could have been a male, and probably Peter. Peter would have been a good primary witness. He was the first disciple, a primary disciple. He was male. He was kind of outspoken, took the charge. Yeah, that would be a good primary witness, but it wasn't Peter. It was written down how it actually happened, whether it made the best case for the resurrection of Jesus or not. It was Mary, the woman, who saw Jesus resurrected from the tomb first. The second evidence that Jesus was resurrected from the tomb is we have no record of the Jewish authorities contesting the empty tomb. The Jews and the early Christians both were aware of where the tomb of Jesus was. If it wasn't really empty, the Jewish authorities who hated Jesus could have pointed to his tomb and said, "Look, he's still there. See for yourself. These rumors are false. He's right there." But nowhere do we find a contesting the fact of the empty tomb. Instead, we find a story being told about how the disciples must have stolen the body. That's why the tomb is empty. The disciples stole the body. In Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15, it says, "When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, 'Tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure.' So they took the money and did as they were instructed. And the saying is commonly reported among the Jews to this day." Now, none of the early Jews disputed the empty tomb. It was simply a question of what happened to the body. The disciples must have taken it. Another evidence for Jesus' resurrection is that the story of the empty tomb is simple and not filled with the grandness of legend. Fictional apocryphal accounts of the resurrection were written in the 2nd century and show Jesus gloriously bursting from the tomb with everyone seeing him, including the priests and the Roman guards and the Jewish authorities and everybody. But instead, what we find is a simple story which shows Jesus being raised to life. Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene comes to anoint Jesus' body, and Jesus reveals himself to her alone as alive. And then he reveals himself to others later. Evidence number 4, would the disciples have given their lives as martyrs for a lie? Would they have all been martyred for a lie? Would you give your life for a lie if you knew it was a lie? Each of the disciples was martyred except John, who was exiled to a rocky island. Fox's Book of Martyrs, the book of Acts, Josephus, and others mention the martyrdom of these disciples. The disciples themselves claim that if the resurrection didn't take place, they were all liars because they claimed to be eyewitnesses of this event. But these same eyewitnesses were willing to give their lives for their testimony. What else explains the disciples running in fear at first and then being willing to lay down their lives at last? The 5th evidence is that the earliest Christian creeds mention Jesus appearing to specific people, and it mentions him appearing to them by name. These creeds date all the way back to 32 to 38 AD, a few years after the resurrection. Here's one of those creeds. It's found in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, "And that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12," Cephas was Peter, "then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, then last of all, he was seen by me," the Apostle Paul, "as by one born out of due time." Michael Green, in his book, The Empty Cross of Jesus, says that the appearances of Jesus are as well authenticated as anything in antiquity. There can be no rational doubt that they occurred, and that the main reason why Christians became sure of the resurrection in the earliest days was just this. They could say with assurance, "We have seen the Lord." They knew it was He. All these eyewitnesses, surely we should see reports from the Jewish authorities at the time saying, "No way, we know where the body of Jesus is. You can see for yourself, he's still in the grave." But again, the Jewish authorities' only counter to all the eyewitness accounts is that the disciples must have stolen the body. But the disciples weren't the only ones who claimed to have seen Jesus. So if they had stolen the body, what do you do with all the other people's claims of having seen Jesus? And the 6th evidence for Jesus' resurrection is, how else do you account for such massive and rapid church growth? How do you account for a religious movement's growth so rapidly without military conquest? By the way, Islam grew through military conquest. With no material advantage, with death, torture, and rejection facing many, if not all, who join this religion at this time. If it's all a farce, there's no way you could get people to join your group, at least not amounts of people in a short amount of time. It was the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection from the dead that spurred such an incredibly rapid growth of the Christian church. The people who went out and preached this message to the world were eyewitnesses whose own lives had been changed by this Jesus. In 1 John 1, verse 3, it says, "That which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly, our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ." Friends, the best explanation for the evidence we've seen is that Jesus died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, and was raised to life after 3 days. If the resurrection of Jesus really didn't happen, then according to Jesus and the apostles' testimony, we can expect if the resurrection of Jesus really did happen, then we can expect a resurrection, a physical resurrection at the end of time as well. Now, maybe tonight you still have some questions. Questions about what happens when you die or the resurrection. Maybe you want to know, what else does the Bible teach about death? This is what our follow-up group Bible studies, small group Bible studies are for. This is a study where every question and comment is welcome. Each Bible study will have a mentor who is familiar enough with the Bible to help guide the lessons. And I really think you'll enjoy it. If that's something you'd be interested in, all you have to do is just fill out the registration card for those small group Bible study lessons. And that will help our small group leaders be able to organize those Bible studies. Well, my friends, we're coming to our final topic. Tomorrow night, we look at the evidence for who Jesus Christ really is. Was He a man, a prophet, a moral teacher, the Messiah? Was He God? You get to decide as we cover this exciting subject together. Thank you for coming again, and have a good evening.